And thanks, Mark, for filling in.
My pleasure.
And your last lecture, you covered a number of topics that were focused on education.
Yeah, I've been concerned for a long time, especially about the poor performance of American kids on math and science tests given internationally. And so that's led me over a number of years to try and propose to the legislature ways to improve math and science achievement. And so I gave the last lecture, ACA lecture, in September of last year on 3 education topics. Usually I focus on science-y type stuff, but science education is also important. And so that lecture was, the 3 topics were low-cost textbooks, progressive vouchers, that's school vouchers, and incorrect TACS scores. And I don't know, would you like me to give?
That's TACS as in TAKS?
Yeah, the statewide academic, well, they're not really they're minimum proficiency tests that kids in Texas have to pass nowadays in order to be eligible to receive a high school diploma. So yeah, I could give a little introduction to the 3 topics and see if that spurs any questions on the part of listeners.
That'd be great.
Okay, low-cost textbooks. Texas, the state of Texas, for K-12 grades, pays excessively high prices for math and science textbooks, and I'm sure for other textbooks too. And so in the year 2000, I proposed to the legislature that the state acquire textbooks at low cost, and there are ways to do that, so that children could be allowed to keep their books permanently, as is the practice in many other places like Japan and Korea and lots of other countries. And a bill was written by Garnet Coleman, a Democratic state representative from Houston, and co-authored by Kent Grusendorf, who is a Republican state representative, or was, from Arlington, that would allow children to permanently keep low-cost textbooks. And they invited me to testify on that. And I concentrated my testimony on the cost comparison for math and science textbooks here in Texas compared to Japan and Korea and a couple other places. So what I did is I summed the state contract prices for one set of textbooks here in Texas that cover math and science for grades 1 through 8. So those 16 books, this is back in 2003, the state contract prices for those 16 books summed to $591. Meanwhile, I contacted the Japanese and Korean embassies and looked at the Ministry of Education's website in Singapore and so on. And in Japan, for the books they use for math and science for grades 1 through 8, they were paying a little under $80 for the whole set. And in South Korea, they were paying under $40 for a whole set. And so those countries are demonstrating that they can acquire math and science textbooks at very low cost, and they let their kids keep them permanently. And of course, their kids happen to be outperforming our kids in math and science. And from there, I have also proposed certain ways that the state of Texas could acquire textbooks at very low cost. Maybe not quite as low as in those other places, but certainly low enough so that we could allow Texas children to also permanently keep their textbooks. And there are big educational benefits in doing that.
There's differences in economy, so obviously we can't hit the exact same target dollars, but
we can get close.
And you're saying that we can get the price low enough so that it's actually more cost effective to allow students to keep them than it is to have them return them, replace them. And Texas is an adoption state as well, so the state adopts one set of books for everybody.
In Texas, in order for a school district or school to be reimbursed by the state for textbooks that school district or school may adopt, they have to select books that are approved by the State Board of Education.
Right.
Yeah. So we can go into some more details on that a little later, this low-cost textbook thing. One of the other topics is a progressive variant of school vouchers. And I became interested about 20 years ago in the question of how can we maximize the public education funds available for the education of any child. And after some thought about it, I really came to the conclusion that you would have to implement a version of school vouchers to do that, but a progressive variant of school vouchers. And so we can go into that in more detail in a little while. Then the third topic, Texas has administered academic achievement tests for many, many years. But in early 2003, I heard that in order to receive high school diplomas, Texas high schoolers would soon need to pass this new set of statewide tests called the TACS tests, which stands for Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills. So I decided that, well, maybe it's finally time to look into the level of the science questions, math and science questions that are being asked on those tests. And so I decided to take the first time that those tests were administered in 2003, they released the questions and answers afterwards. And so I decided, well, I'll just take the highest level, the 11th grade science test, and see what the level of the questions were. And I was surprised to find, I got to question 45 out of about 55 questions, and I was surprised to find that there were no correct answers listed for that question. And so I immediately notified the Student Assessment Division at the Texas Education Agency that this question had no correct answers. And then I decided the next morning well, if they can make such a blunder on one question, maybe I ought to check my answers against the answer key that the Texas Education Agency provided. And sure enough, on question 11, I found that the Texas Education Agency had given credit for an incorrect answer and failed to give credit for a correct answer. So I looked through some of the other tests that had been released as well back then. And in the end, I found several questions on which roughly 500,000 students had been issued incorrect scores. And none of them have been corrected, even despite my attempts to get the Texas Education Agency and State Board of Education to correct the mistakes.
Did you get any kind of response from them?
Yes, I did. I got official responses from a Dr. Ann Smisko, who was then the Associate Commissioner for curriculum for assessment. Her job covered assessment. The commissioner at that time had recently resigned, so she was one of the top people at the Texas Education Agency, and she handled that division. And I also notified some news organizations, and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram had a couple of articles and a couple letters to the editors about the problems. And the New York Times also covered a couple of the questions.
So basically, you've got a standardized test that's being given to students across the board who aren't getting credit for correct answers. They're getting marked. They're getting credit for answers that are incorrect. And what about the level of testing? You said you started with the 11th grade test. Are the standards high enough? Are they what they should be for 11th grade?
Well, I wasn't expecting that the level of the questions would be very high, and I pretty much found that to be true. The level of the questions were not very high. It's not a real academic achievement test. It's a minimum proficiency test.
Right.
So that didn't really surprise me. But whether the scores that you're issuing are correct, that's even a more fundamental problem than the level of the questions.
Yeah.
And I was really surprised to find that incorrect scores had been issued.
Now, this was a 2003 test. Do we know if these questions are still on there and they're still incorrect, or have they been scrubbed?
Well, since those particular questions had been released to the public, I don't think they would reuse those particular questions again. And the Texas Education Agency and State Board of Education have only released tests since then on every even-numbered year, and they are not releasing tests on the subsequent odd-numbered years. So no one in the public has the opportunity to check the 2005 or 2007 tests for the level of the questions or the correctness of the answers. And given the fact that the Texas Education Agency has issued incorrect scores, it is important, I think, to allow the public to review the questions for appropriateness and correctness.
I'd have to agree. I'm not sure how we can keep operating and pretending that we're going to be improving the educational system if we're not, having some minimal form of oversight.
I happen to believe that it is important to administer tests district-wide or statewide in this case, in order for the public to be informed, at least to some level, about how well the school system is doing. And regarding one of the questions that I found that mistakes had been made on, where the TA gave credit for an incorrect answer and denied credit for a correct answer, if you were to take what the TA says is correct for that question, you might think that 82% of the high schoolers, of the 11th graders, gave a correct question for that physics question, a correct answer for that physics question. But in reality, only 5% of Texas 11th graders gave the correct answer for that physics question. And some of them may simply have guessed. And so I don't know if, and it's important to know, it's important for the public to know that, that at least on that question, it gives the public some indication that the system of education in Texas is to some extent failing to teach kids how to do these physics problems.
And it may be the case, as I mentioned at the top of the show, that the education system in Texas is in jeopardy of possibly getting worse, especially with regard to science education and matters of evolution. I don't know why we keep fighting this creationism versus evolution fight. But as a quick reminder, the telephone number's up on the screen if you'd like to call in and talk about any of these education issues or anything else. Topics regarding church-state separation, religious issues, corrections from past shows, things like that. If you'd like to call in, the number's up on the screen.
And by the way, I'd like to let viewers know that I have posted a lot of information on these three topics on a website that I've created. And I think that could be queued up by the guys in the control room. It's markloewe.org. That's MARKLOEWE. That's my last name, .org. All one word.
There it is. Mm-hmm. Let's go back for a second to low-cost textbooks, which was one of the first things that you and I discussed when we started having conversations after I joined the ACA and everything. It was one of the first things we discussed where I was just immediately ready to get on board with it because it sounds like such a good idea. What are the benefits to the student of being able to keep their textbooks? Well,
okay, first off, presumably students have studied these very books for a semester or for a year. So they've added a lot of value to those particular books through study of those books. They know pretty much they should know pretty much what's in the books and where it is in the book. And so that adds value to the book as a reference for the future. And so anytime in the future they could, it's a lot easier to review the books that they actually learn from than to not have any books or to review other books that might be in some library somewhere that they'd have to go to that they're not particularly familiar with. And so there are direct educational benefits to the students in keeping their own books permanently. And maybe during the summer or some other time, maybe they might want to. They can review those books whenever they need to, or whenever they wish to. So there are direct educational benefits to allowing children to permanently keep their books, and there are indirect benefits. In the United States, since authors cannot expect that children will have any of their previous books available at home or anywhere else, the authors have to provide a lot more review material in the book that is intended for the current year that might be given to a student. And the same thing for teachers. Our teachers cannot expect children will have ready home access to their familiar books from previous years at home. And so our teachers are excessively burdened with the need to cover review material. And so our books, compared to books in some other countries where kids are allowed to keep them permanently, our books and our teachers tend to cover a lot more review material, and sometimes the same material year after year, unnecessarily. And that wastes a lot of time that could be better used to go into more detail in the topics that are supposed to be covered in the current semester or year.
Not only that, but if you allow the kids to keep the books, the next year's book does not need to contain that review material, making the book smaller and therefore cheaper.
Yeah, that's true. The books, if you let kids keep their books permanently, the books would not need to contain as much review material, making them smaller and less expensive. If you let kids keep their books permanently, then the books would not have to be manufactured to last through multiple children, none of whom treat the book as their own property. Instead, if a kid knew that book was his or her property, he generally speaking, a kid would take better care of that book. And so you can issue, for the most part, paperback books, which is the case in a lot of other countries. And that book only has to last through one kid for 1 year. And so it doesn't need to be as durable, and that also reduces the cost. Plus, if you let kids keep their books permanently, you'd be printing, maybe 5 or 6 times more books, and the greater volume will tend to reduce the costs. So there are a lot of advantages. Oh, and also, I was looking at some math and science books that are used in Korea, or were a number of years ago, and I could hold the math and science books for grades 6, 7, and 8 in one hand. They're a lot lighter, and it would be easier for kids to carry them around wherever, going to and from school, rather than just leaving them in the locker and not taking them home, or just leaving them at home and not taking them to school where they might need them.
Yeah, and a lot of, we've talked about this before, and every now and then somebody will come up with some kind of anecdotal comment about, just because the kid knows that it's going to be their book doesn't mean they're more likely to take care of it. We've got a problem with kids in the education system today who just don't care. This isn't designed in any way to fix those problems. There are other big problems with education that we need to be addressing with regard to teacher salaries, how to draw in new teachers, how to motivate students, how to get kids more interested in learning. But I can't find, as much as I'd like to kind of go the sky is falling route and education is, we're at the bottom of the barrel and there's so many other countries that are beating us. I think that we're underestimating how much our future generations are going to be willing to learn things as long as you provide them the opportunity and encouragement to do so. I don't know I don't think we can fix the whole education system here today on our show, but.
Well, there are a lot of factors that may influence academic achievement. A lot of them are cultural or economic and are really difficult to do anything about. But this factor of whether you simply let kids keep their books permanently, that's an easy thing to do something about, and it would be essentially cost neutral. because right now Texas is paying excessively high prices for books, and on the order of maybe $40 per copy. And under some plans that I proposed to the legislature, I show how the state could very likely acquire books, math and science books, for on the order of maybe $5 or $6 per copy. And even though more copies would need to be purchased, the state wouldn't necessarily need to pay any more total money for textbooks. It would be, I think it would be essentially cost neutral to allow children to permanently keep their textbooks. And then you'd gain all the educational advantages.
Well, they end up reviewing all the standards every, how many years is it between reviewing standards for math and science?
I think that the cycle is roughly once every 6 years. They review the curriculum for a particular subject.
You're paying for an expensive book, and you're probably going to have to replace it based on the new standards in 6 years anyway.
But on the other hand, some school districts have used, even though the books have been, that are on the state's approved list have been, even though that list may have been modified within the last 6 years, some school districts use the same book for a particular subject for more than 10 years.
And in the case of math, that may not be a huge problem. Yeah. But in the case of science books, it may in fact be. One of the things, science comes under criticism, especially from religious people about being, science doesn't really prove anything, and it's constantly changing, and anytime the data changes, science changes. And they look at this as a negative. As if, hey, our religion said the same thing for thousands of years. It's not changed at all. How do you go? Why should you want to teach science where it keeps on changing? They must have got it wrong before. And the whole point is that science has these methods in it to not only admit that it got it wrong, but demonstrate that it got it wrong and that it's got it right or more right now. And that the change in ideas is one of the beautiful benefits of science. It's like the people who make the claim about evolution saying, well, it's just a theory. No, it's not just a theory. It's a theory. Theory is the graduation point in science. Theory is the best thing we have when we're talking about developing descriptions of the universe and coming to an understanding of reality. Now, when you've got science and changes in scientific information, it's a good thing that the textbooks get revised with new and better information. And the same people who are complaining that the biology books have these outdated pictures of fetuses with gills are the ones that are saying, no, why would you want to trust anything that needs to get updated from time to time? Well, because we found out that was wrong.
Well, the question about curricula is a big question. And but whether you let kids keep their books permanently or not, that's independent of curriculum. I think that should be done pretty much independent of curriculum. For math and science, especially for the lower grades, I wouldn't expect that the subjects taught would change very much. That would tend to happen more in the upper grades. And so conceivably, if you're talking about a second or third grade math book, if a good one can be produced, that could conceivably be used for decades without any need to update the book.